I'll admit that I'm surprised to be here. When I got the invitation, I thought, what would a tax guy have to say to demographers? But then with Sven's introduction, I now understand. Demography is at the center of everything, including taxes. So in any event, as I thought about this opportunity, I was reminded of a presentation that I saw that Natalie Gochner gave at the Governor's Economic Summit, in which the whole issue of tax reform in the state was introduced. And her presentation was about demography and its connection. Now, what she didn't do as well as I wanted at that point was to explore the implications of the demographic changes that she described for taxes and tax policy and tax reform. And so I'd like today to spend a few minutes. I'm going to review some of the work very quickly that many of you in this room were actively involved in or actually did. And I acknowledge your contributions, plagiarized it liberally, but I will give you credit for it. And then I want to talk about how those demographic changes are changing in the geography, because I think it's not just demography, it's also geography that's at the center of everything. But and then we want to talk about the impact on tax bases. And given that most of the forecasted growth will occur in Salt Lake and Utah counties, I want to zero in on those two counties, talk a little bit about the cost of government and how that varies, and then offer a few concluding thoughts. So feel free to ask questions along the way, and we'll also have some opportunity for discussion when we get done. So let's look first to the future. Again, all of this work, this part of it comes from the Kem Gardner Policy Institute, but done by people here in this room, and I am very appreciative of their work. But essentially what they're showing is that by 2065, Utah's population will be just over 5.8 million. We should hit the 4 million mark in 2032, the 5 million mark 2050. And what I find interesting about this forecasted growth is it doesn't look hugely different from what we've seen in the past 40 years. It's a little bit faster than what we have seen, but it's pretty much continuing trends that have already been in place for many decades. Okay? And that raises some interesting questions for me, but we'll get to those. The components of change, historically we've seen a lot of bouncing around on the in-migration. The forecast is that we're going to see a fairly stable influx of people from out of the state. Birth rates will be fairly stable. Interestingly enough, though, birth rates are declining and are just barely above replacement level. Nationally, they are below replacement. And this has some implications for policy, I think. It changes the age structure. In 2015, we had about 49% of the population in that 25 to 64 year range. The percentage of children is likely to decline. The percentage of old folks like me is likely to increase. Okay? Nationally, when that has happened in communities, there's been a shift in the constituency for public education. For whatever reason, older taxpayers seem to be less willing to remember that the taxpayers paid for their kids to go to school, and are less willing to support public education, more interested in services for the elderly. So this kind of a change with oops, wrong button. Actually increasing dependency ratio, but most of the increase is coming in the group over 65 suggests that the constituency for public education may be threatened going forward as well. And that's something that may be a few years down the road, but we'll see that emerge, I think, in the next year or two around this whole issue of the earmark of the income tax for public education and whether or not that should be changed. That'll take a vote of the public, so we'll see how supportive the public is of public education. The geography of, 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 as you well know, Utah is one of the most urbanized states in the nation. About 1.1% of our land is considered urban, but 90% of our population is urban. And that one of the implications of the changing growth that we've seen is that the center of population has moved. In the 1950s, it was just north of Alpine, and then it moved up to about 94th South, I think it is. No, 114th South. Well, no, up to 100, all the way up to 106th South, before it dropped all the way back down to Lehigh. It's not moving around very much. You know, the population centers in the state are staying in Salt Lake, and to the extent that they're moving south, it's moving into Utah County and a little bit on the northwest part of Utah County. So the total population projected in 2065, 1.6 million Utah County, 1.7 million Salt Lake County, a couple of other counties over 500,000, but that's where really Salt Lake, Utah, Davis County, that's where the population centers are and will continue to be. To the extent that there is growth in the rest of the state, it's going to be relatively modest. Okay. So the county's share of population, 2065, 30% in Salt Lake, 28% in Utah counties. Washington County is increasing to almost 9%. And the absolute change, we're going to see over 1 million people moving into Utah County, another 600,000 moving into Salt Lake County, smaller amounts elsewhere in the state. Okay. That's going to change the concentration of people in Utah. Now, I've just done some rough calculations here. The projected annual growth for the counties that are expected to see over 100% increase is on the order of Washington County, 2.4%. Salt Lake County is going to see a lot of people, but the percentage increase is only going to be about 0.84% compared to the historical pattern, an average of about 1.9%. The balance of the state, again, less than 1%. Noticeable growth, but at a much slower rate. And I guess the other thing I have to say is, it's nice to be here because I'm a numbers guy. I like looking at this stuff. And I'm assuming that demographers like looking at this stuff too, which is why I was comfortable doing this. So if your eyes start going blurry or bleary, then don't snore too loudly, because I'm going to keep doing this stuff. So I really like it, okay? All right, so county population totals. You can see the graphs that are the projections here for Davis, Salt Lake, Utah, Washington, and Weber. The red line on top is Salt Lake. The increasing gray line is Utah County. Other counties will increase. Washington County will see a significant increase in overall population. This is one that I find pretty interesting. The concentration, the percent of the population in each of these counties is, for Salt Lake and Utah, is going to converge. Salt Lake County's percent of the total population is going to continue to decline. It's not that their population is going to decline, but the percent of the total is going to decline as Utah grows, as Washington County grows, but particularly Utah County. So, what will those projected growth mean? What does that projected growth mean for local governments? How will it impact public spending? And will the revenues grow sufficiently to meet the expanded service demands? To answer that question, I think it's important, first of all, for us to get clear on how we currently fund government. You'll hear discussions about what's called a three-legged stool. And by that, people refer to the property tax, income tax, the sales tax as the three mainstays of public finance. And that's true to some extent, but it's I think an unfortunately limited view. I think if we take a slightly broader view and let's say, okay, well, let's look at the four-legged stool approach. We add in federal government revenue, which is often allocated based on population. it represents, if we look at the four of those sources combined, federal government revenue is about 30% of what of the revenue necessary to fund a combination of state and local government in the state. But even that view is still just a bit narrow, so I want to take a five-legged view. In the five-legged view, we add in charges. Now, this is not the utility charges, but this is building permit fees, and it's other kinds of charges that are assessed for services provided by government. It may be tuition at the universities, it may be school fees charged, but it's all of those charges that state and local government assess in addition to the money we get from the federal government or from income, property, and sales tax. Okay. So now this is a combination of both federal and state, or excuse me, state and local government. We get a different picture if we look at just local government. Here we see that the mainstay really is property tax. 34% of the money that we spend on local government comes from the property tax. 36% of it comes from the transfers from the state. There's a small amount, about 5%, that comes from the federal government, about 13% in charges. Yes, there's sales tax, there is no local income tax, but the mainstays for revenue for local government are a combination of property taxes and transfers from the state. And the reason for that is that most of what we do at the local level is education. About 58% of the money that is spent at the local government level is spent on public education. And that's funded by property tax. 60% of the property tax goes for public education, and then transfers from the state, and that's where the income tax comes back into local governments, because in Utah, as you've undoubtedly heard lately, the income tax is earmarked in the Constitution. It has to go for education. Now, we changed the Constitution a few years back so that it's not just K through 12, it's also higher ed, but it has to go for education. And one of the controversies will be in the months ahead, should we change that? And I'll show you why that issue comes up. Okay, so that's how we fund government. So now let's take a slightly deeper look at Salt Lake and Utah counties. Okay. Because again, they represent the largest share of the growth, the major population centers now and moving into the future. And particularly in Utah County, we're going to see some rather significant changes. So the question is, will the trends that have developed over the past 40 years continue for the next 40 years when we talk about demand for services and funding government? So again, 58% of the expected growth will occur in Salt Lake and Utah counties. So let's look at the population trends there again. This is Salt Lake and Utah counties' percent of state population. It has been, in 1988, it was 42.3% in Salt Lake County. That's expected to decline, or did decline by 2018 to 36.6%. Utah County's population as a share of the total has increased, which suggests that the growth in Utah County has been stronger than as a percentage of the state total than in Salt Lake County. So this is the population. What about the tax base? Remember I said the majority of the primary local government tax is the property tax. So here I've given you the population trend for Salt Lake County and two categories of property. The primary residential property. Primary residential, it's important to understand that, because if a home is someone's primary residence, then they get a 45% reduction in their property tax. If it's a seasonal home, if it's if it's not a primary residence, it does not get that reduction. Okay. All other property, the commercial, the industrial, the other residential should be valued, it's supposed to be valued at 100% of its market value. But that primary residential category, which is the largest single category of property value, gets a 45% reduction in value. Okay? So in 1988, primary residential property was 47% of the, 47% of the total primary residential property value in the state was in Salt Lake County. That has declined to 41% by 2018. That, again, reflects the fact that we see more population moving into Utah County and Weber County and Davis County, Washington County, and so we're building homes in those areas. So as a percentage of the total, we see some shift out of Salt Lake County. What I find fascinating about this is the other category. This is commercial and industrial property. Okay? It was 34% in 1988. It grew to 45%, and then it's staying right there through 2018. And what that means is that, yes, there are lots of people moving in to these other parts of the state, but the commercial investment doesn't seem to be following at the same state. It's remaining relatively concentrated in Salt Lake County. Okay? So yes, there's investment along the Silicon Slopes and elsewhere in Utah County, elsewhere in the state, but in terms of the overall growth of the state, it still remains concentrated in Salt Lake. Okay. If we look at the same kind of information for Utah County, we see the increasing proportion of population, modestly increasing proportion of the housing value, and yes, there's been some growth in the commercial and industrial, but for the last 10 to 20 years, it's been pretty flat as a percentage of the state's total. So again, remember, where's the money going to come from to pay for the education of these kids that are going to be expected to move in? Well, with that 45% reduction that primary residents get, most people don't pay the full freight for their kids to go to school, okay? Which is why, and I'm okay with that as long as they keep paying when their kids get out of school, okay? I'm still paying for the 7 that I put through public schools, and I'm fine with that, okay? But to get the money today, to fund the education today, we often have to look to the commercial, industrial, that non-residential non-residential and other residential property, which in Utah County, not the that other residential property is a very small proportion of what we have. The other factor in all of this is that the income in Utah County doesn't seem to be growing any faster than the income elsewhere in the state. So as a percentage of Salt Lake County, personal income, or per capita personal income in Utah County since the late 90s has been between 70 and 75% up through about 2014, 2015. In more recent years, it's climbed all the way up to 77%. Okay. So it's still pretty flat as in relation to, it's growing, but it's growing at the same rate that Salt Lake County is and the rest of the state. We're not gaining any ground there. Okay. And that brings us to the other tax bases. This is taxable sales. Taxable sales per capita. This is what we actually levy the sales tax on in Salt Lake and Utah County. And you can see that the lines are essentially parallel, but at Utah County's is a much lower level. Spending for taxable goods in Utah County on a per capita basis is significantly below Salt Lake County. As a percent of personal income, taxable sales across the state is declining. Again, we see a similar pattern though between Salt Lake and Utah County, that the they're both declining. They're both declining at about the same rate. Utah County is spending a smaller percentage of their income on taxable sales than Salt Lake County is. Now, some of that may be due to the fact that people in Utah County go to Salt Lake County to buy some things. That's quite possible. Undoubtedly happens. And they may be coming in from Summit County and Tooele County into Salt Lake County to buy things as well, which may inflate those numbers. But the pattern is pretty clear. Whatever the growth is in Utah County, it's growing that fast or faster in Salt Lake County. And this chart, in conjunction with the next one I'm going to show you, is why the legislature is hyperventilating right now. Okay? Because the argument that's being made is that our sales tax base, which funds most, because again, let me back up just for 1 sec. If the income tax is earmarked for education, where does the state get the money to fund the rest of state government? Property tax is a local government tax. The state doesn't get any of that. Its income tax all goes to education. What's left? Well, it's the other leg if it's a three-legged approach. It's the other two legs if it's a five-legged approach, but it's largely sales tax, federal transfers, charges. Okay? So when they look at the state looks at this and say, okay, as a percent of income, sales, taxable sales are declining, even though the sales tax revenue may be increasing, it's not increasing as fast as income. And that means that when we look at this one, which is the trend in the income tax revenue is growing fairly rapidly, but all of that has to go to education, which I think really irritates some legislators. But the sales tax, which funds the rest of state government, is not growing as fast as the economy. Income tax is. Okay, it's doing just fine. Sales tax is not growing as fast. Okay? So that's why the legislature is saying we need to figure out ways that we can change this. One of the proposals that will be coming out is, should we remove that earmark for public education so that the general fund, so that the income tax money can be spent on roads, on other state activities besides education. And that's an issue that will be hotly debated and contested, and ultimately the voters will have to decide. But the other issue to bear in mind, and when we look at the taxable sales, is that a lot of the problems that the legislature has balancing its own budget on the general fund side are due to issues or problems that they created themselves by putting in place exemptions for some goods, by putting in place earmarks for transportation and water projects. They restricted their ability to maneuver with that sales tax. And that those decisions, whether they were good or bad in the past, they're now coming home to roost, and we have some challenges we face. Okay, that's a bit of a digression there. All right, so I want to talk for a bit about the cost of government. To do this, I've used a county as an area. You have to remember that there are 29 counties, but there are 250 municipalities, there are 41 school districts, there are 299 special districts, and these may be fire districts or water districts, but they're a special purpose government created to do a small set of things, but they have their own taxing and spending authority. Okay? So we have, in fact, 619 local government entities in Utah, and I've grouped those by county. So I'm going to look at because in some ways it doesn't really make any difference, or it may make a difference, but it's a matter of local choice whether you have one school district in Utah County or 3 school districts in Utah County, whether you have 4 school districts in Salt Lake County, 1 school district in Salt Lake County, or 5 or 6 or however many. That's a matter of local choice. My interest for our discussion today is, what does it cost to provide local government services in Salt Lake County, in Utah County, elsewhere in the state? Okay, so I'm grouping them by county, saying all of the local governments in a county. That's my unit of analysis here. So if we look at Salt Lake County, at the expenditures as a percent of personal income, and I have to do this in 5-year chunks because the Census Bureau collects this information, but they only get a complete count every 5 years. They do surveys every year, but to get what they call the census of government, that happens every 5 years. And so I have to look at 72, 77, 5-year increments in order to make sure I've got all of the government units within the county. Salt Lake County in the early 70s was spending about 6%, 6.2% of personal income on current expenditures. This isn't capital activities, this is just current operations. Okay? They spent another 1 3/4 or 2% on those capital and on servicing debt. Okay? Those numbers grew as the county grew. And by the late 80s, it was almost 15% for current operations and over 8% for capital projects, for debt. And I put those two together because, again, I'm dealing in 5-year chunks here. And so my reasoning is if they borrowed money to build roads or other capital infrastructure between the census years, looking at just the capital expenditures in the census year isn't going to pick that up. But if I look at the debt service, I'll get some reflection of what they were continuing to spend for capital projects, since the debt that is incurred by local governments is for capital projects. So whether it be schools or roads or whatever. It's not a perfect measure, acknowledge that, and we can quibble about it, but I think it's an interesting one. Through the 90s and after the turn of the century, those numbers began to fall, and for the last, the most recent data that's available, 2012, the 2017 census data isn't out yet. Hopefully it'll be out in the next month or so. But for the last decade or so, it's been hovering at around 8.5% of personal income to provide all of the constellation of local government services in Salt Lake County. Debt service and capital projects have been just over 2.5% of personal income. Okay. Now, that's the county that has seen the most significant growth through this period of time. Utah County also grew. We know that their incomes are lower, so if it's the same cost of government, we'd expect to see a higher percentage of personal income. In fact, we see a lower percentage of personal income. Excuse me. The number hasn't, again, Salt Lake County was in the 6s and then went up over 14. Utah County has been much more consistent. It also grew from the 70s up into the late 80s. It hasn't fallen as fast. It's still around 8.5 to 9%. But given that difference in income, that Utah County income is only about 75, 77% of Salt Lake County income, to say that they're spending the same percentage of income on public services says that they're spending significantly fewer dollars on personal. And the other thing that I find a little bit noticeable here is the much lower level of capital investment in Utah County. They haven't yet geared up to meet the demands of the growth that's come, or certainly not the growth that is yet to come. If we look at and this makes the point that I just mentioned, that if we look at the current expenditures per capita, Utah County as a percent of Salt Lake County, you can see that it is still running at about 75, 77% of what it is in Utah County. And you have to ask, are public employees earning that much less in Utah County? Does the cost of goods and materials that much lower in Utah County? I suspect not. I suspect that there are other explanations that we may be just doing less, and that may be a matter of choice. It may be that the people in Utah County like smaller government and are willing to spend less on it. Okay, that's a choice. As we look at another 1 million people moving into the county, that's going to put some strain on that particular choice. Okay, one other point I wanted to make here, what I've done here in this rather busy graph is to look not only at Salt Lake and Utah County, but the rest of the state. And the numbers that I posted here show the current expenditures, current operations, as a percent of personal income, and you can see that outside of Salt Lake and Utah County, except for 1987, in every other year, the cost of government as a percent of income is significantly higher once you get off the outside of Salt Lake and Utah County. Okay? And you have to ask, why? Why would that be? Again, is it more expensive to hire a police officer in Daggett County than it is in Salt Lake or Utah County? Is it more expensive for firefighters in Paiute County or in Duchesne? I think there's another explanation, and I think it has to do with what we would call the exportation of taxes. Remember, I talked about the primary residential getting a 45% reduction, other kinds of residential doesn't. Well, in counties like Summit County or Rich County, where you have a lot of vacation homes, a lot of seasonal housing, that housing is taxed at 100% of its value. They don't get the 45% reduction. They also don't live there. They don't vote. Okay, so one possibility is that we tax that property more heavily. The other issue is what we call state-assessed property. These are large companies. This is the Utah Power and Light, Pacific Corp. This is Delta Airlines. It's the railroads. It's the pipelines. It's these big companies that have assets spread across not just multiple counties, but multiple states in many instances. Their taxable value is set each year by the State Tax Commission. It's then assigned, allocated out to the counties, and the counties generate the tax bills. Well, in some of these more rural counties, that kind of property may represent 80 to 85 to 90% of the tax base. Okay, so now think about the dynamics here. You're a county commissioner, or you're sitting on the local school board, and you're saying, okay, we need some more money, or we'd like to have some more money. If we raise the property tax, who's going to pay it? Well, let's see. We have 30% of our housing is non-residents, and 60% of our tax base is these big companies. Let's raise the property tax, because people who don't live here and don't vote will end up paying it. And that's what we see in this table that I've given you here. I've arbitrarily picked a threshold of 25% or less of the residential property, of the total property value is in this other residential. 40% or less of the total property value is these centrally assessed properties. If you're in this cell, then your spending is only about 76% of the state average. But if you've got more than 40% of your value in these centrally assessed properties, even though you've got relatively little seasonal housing, your spending is about 110% of the state average. And if you've got more than 25% of your property value in the seasonal housing, even though you've got less than 40% of the property value in centrally assessed, you're going to spend 122%. Okay. Again, the notion is, if you happen to be down here, you're spending twice the state average. Okay. It's not necessarily that the costs are higher. Some costs may be higher. It may be more expensive to get someone to be a police officer in Daggett County than it is in Utah County. But I think the more likely explanation is we can tax people who aren't going to vote, who aren't going to show up at our commission meetings, and we can get those non-residents, because who pays the property tax for Utah Power and Light? It's ratepayers all over the western United States. It's maybe shareholders, but it's certainly not the people that live in Emery County. Okay. So that's my explanation. So what does this all mean? I think we're about out of time. Let me give you a quick summary here. Property tax. Salt Lake continues to dominate the commercial and industrial tax base. 45% of the state total is in Salt Lake County, and that's staying pretty constant, even as the share of population declines. Utah's share of residential is increasing, but it's still lagging behind Salt Lake. And these state-assessed and other residential will continue to dominate rural areas. That's where they get their money. That's what makes it possible for them to function. On the income and sales tax side, Utah County incomes remain at about the same level in relation to Salt Lake levels. Taxable sales continue to drift downward. Income tax is growing. It's growing at about the same rate in Salt Lake and Utah counties. What does it mean for the cost of government? Salt Lake's current expenditures appear to be holding at about 8.5% of personal income. Utah County levels are similar as a percent of income, but we saw that they're about 75% of the Salt Lake County levels. Utah County costs are increasing in relation to Salt Lake, and I think that's going to continue to be the case. I think it's going to be more and more difficult for Utah County to keep its cost of government 25% less than Salt Lake County. That's not necessarily their explicit policy goal. That's the effect of what's been happening. I think it's going to be harder and harder to do that. And the counties that are able to export their taxes tend to spend and will continue to spend at higher levels on a per resident basis. So the bottom line from my view is Utah County will see strong population growth, but I think they're going to struggle. I think they're going to have significant challenges in generating the revenue to maintain and expand the services to meet that increased demand. And with that, what do you think? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. So the lower income level in Utah County, is that is that because of younger families? Is that an age-adjusted figure, or what do you think?
It is a per capita level, so to the extent that the household size in Utah County is larger, that may account for part of it. I don't think, the median age, I think, is a bit lower in Utah County than it is in Salt Lake County. But I don't think that accounts for all of the difference that we're seeing. But it certainly bears further explanation. So, other questions? Yes?
So Ken Smith is my name, and we maintain a database at the University of Utah, and we have a lot of state agencies that contribute information for the research community. And I don't know if you're in a position to comment on this, but you presented a lot of great data, and it just, of course, creates the appetite for getting access to the data.
Good.
So this is sort of kind of outside your specific question, but to really entice others to use tax commission information in the way that you're using it, but really to make it a more accessible, more kind of convenient and efficient access to the research community. Is that something? What's the posture of the tax commission for providing data to the research community? I know Kim Gardner Center, the Policy Center, is part of it, but how far does it go? What's the kind of philosophy of sharing data sharing and things like that?
I can tell you my own. As I put the disclaimer up at the beginning, I don't speak for the entire tax commission. That takes a vote of 4 of us, and I'm only one of those votes. But by and large, we have a website that has a fair amount. If you go to the Tax Commission, tax.utah.gov, and click on the Commission website page, there is an economics and statistics page there that has information on taxes, on and historical information on taxes, at least summarized. So there's there's income tax, there's sales tax, there's property tax information. The issue that we confront for some of it is confidentiality. We cannot reveal, for example, the big box sales in Provo for a particular period of time, because if I told you that, you could figure out what all the big box stores are, who the big box stores are, and you could figure out what each is spending. And so we have to protect that confidentiality. But we can tell you what that category is, the general merchandise category. We can tell you those sales in Provo, and we do. That's on the website. On the income tax side, anything that would let you get to a specific individual's tax return, we can't reveal that. We use some of that for our own internal research and to respond to a request from the legislature. But you have to be, even elsewhere in state government, like in the legislature, they can't get access to it. They have to technically be an employee of the state tax commission in order to access individual tax return data. Yes?
If I could just maybe
Sure.
quick comment on that, your last point. So I'm going to be speaking later today, and one of the mechanisms for getting access to with all the confidentiality protections, getting access to individual level income, there's a mechanism at the federal level. Well, there's a way to do that. It's not straightforward and it requires effort, of course, but there is a mechanism. And it would be great if there was a way to get that kind of information from our own local or state government.
Yeah.
But there's actually a way to do it through the federal government, so it seems kind of a bit of irony that we would have to go to the federal government to get Utah data when it would be, of course, preferable.
And I would agree. And I think we should explore that further, because given that there is a way that you can do it at the federal level, we need to figure out because it's the federal restrictions that we worry about. We get audited every year by the IRS to make sure that our security provisions are adequate to protect taxpayer information. And I can tell you the Tax Commission is really paranoid about that. I mean, I've been there for a year now, and you got a badge into this part of the building, to that part of the building, you got a badge to use the elevator. They're really security conscious, and I appreciate that, because I don't want mine or anybody else's tax data to be just floating around. On the other hand, I think that if the feds have figured out a way that they can make individual tax returns available for research purposes, then we ought to be able to have a parallel process in the state. We ought to pursue that. Yes, ma'am.
Do you mind going back to your second to last slide? Would that be all right? I just wanted to, the orange one. So, yes, yeah, I just want to take a photo. If that's all right.
Sure. Just to make sure you include the "I think" part. So. Yes, ma'am.
With the discussion about reviewing or changing exempt goods sales tax, does that stem from the tax commission, or does the legislature say we want to review, changing the exemption status for this good or this category of goods, and they come to you, the tax commission, and say, can you give us information on that? Or does the legislature, do they say, we're just looking at all goods and then giving all goods information? Or what's the back and forth with the legislature and the tax commission on something like that?
That's a good question. During the legislative session, when the tax reform was being hotly debated, and there were, that was the legislators having that discussion. They didn't tell because okay, let me tell you a little bit about the process. When a bill comes up in the legislature for serious consideration, it has to have what's known as a fiscal note, which is an estimate of what it's going to cost the state, and the tax commission is actively involved in producing those fiscal notes. We don't generate the bill, but we have to put the note on it. It's done in conjunction with the Legislative Fiscal Analyst's Office, which are staff that work directly for the legislature. We technically work for the governor, since we're in the executive branch. But it's a collaborative effort that we come up with those fiscal notes and put a price tag on it. When they were talking about tax reform during the legislative session, we did not get consulted until the bill was made public. And at that point, it was changing 2 or 3 times during the day, and we were scrambling to try to come up with fiscal notes on it. So we were not consulted particularly during that process. And it was pretty frustrating for us because we're the ones that have to implement whatever they decide. We have to administer it. We have to figure out, okay, if you're going to tax attorneys, then how do I find out what they owe? So we were pretty frustrated about that. And the discussion that's ensued since, we have made presentations, but again, we have not generated very many new ideas on how to do it. If they ask us questions, we try to come up with the best data and analysis we can, but they haven't asked very many questions. In fact, in the article that I read this morning, the proposals that are actually going to be coming out later today, I think, and being discussed at a public meeting on Tuesday, most of those proposals were not even discussed in their task force. So I'm not sure exactly where they came from, but I can tell you the Tax Commission hasn't generated any of those, but I'm sure we'll be asked to put a price on them. How much money is it going to generate, or what it's going to cost? And that's tough to do with things like sales tax exemptions, because if you remove an exemption, in order to estimate how much revenue that's going to generate, you need to know what the sales are. Well, if it's not taxable, we don't collect the information on what the sales are, and so it's a little tough to come up with those estimates. So, other questions? Yes.
Kathleen Zick, I'm
Yes.
from the University of Utah. So, I think this seems to be a somewhat conservative conclusion that you're reaching, because earlier in your talk when you were speaking about the change in the demographic composition of the state's population, with more older people being less likely to be supportive of investments in public education. We've got a county here where the population growth it's younger, and there are probably there are going to be higher demand for public education in Utah County relative to probably any other county in the state, and yet we seem to be moving in a direction in terms of overall demographics where there might be less support for public education. So if you think about those services in particular, this paints a rather concerning picture.
It does, especially, and I think that the issue that you raised will be exacerbated if the trend continues that the commercial and industrial property is not developed in Utah County. It continues to be concentrated in Salt Lake and elsewhere. Then there's going to be pressure to transfer some of those funds into Utah County to support education, and the constituency in those areas may not be there to do it. So you raise a very valid point. Here's the answer.
I just have a quick question. I know that Amazon not to be taxed before, but right now all the transactions, but it's different from the traditional sales, which is at the spot of the transaction, right? So Amazon is based on transportation and also where people purchase the items. So has that changed the calculation and become bigger part of the sales tax collection?
That's an excellent question. Prior to a year or two ago, when a Supreme Court case called Wayfair came down and said states states can tax those remote sales, you had to have a physical presence in the state in order to be required to collect sales tax. So if you were in South Dakota and shipping goods into Utah and you didn't have a physical presence here, you didn't have to collect the sales tax even though it was a Utah sale. That doesn't mean the tax wasn't owed, because all of our honest taxpayers in Utah would on their income tax return say, oh, I bought some things out of state, so I have to pay use tax, here's how much I owe. We all did that, right? Yeah, right. No, we didn't do that. So, but Wayfair said, okay, the technology is such that the states should now be able to tax those remote transactions without putting too large a burden on interstate commerce. Utah passed a law, said, okay, we're going to do that. There were some people who thought that was going to be a windfall, that we're going to generate just hundreds of millions of dollars from those remote sales. Hasn't happened yet. And we're watching that fairly carefully, because as the tax commission we can tell where the tax dollars are coming in. And you know, it's in the millions, it's not in the tens, it may even be in the tens of millions, it's not in the hundreds of millions by any means. So it's going to be an issue, but it's not the silver bullet that's going to solve all the state's problems. Good question though. Yes, ma'am.
Sort of related to that, but about when businesses come in, I was really interested in your commercial tax rate figures, and sometimes I hear in the news that, local governments are trying to negotiate tax packages and tax breaks with businesses, but it seems like these local businesses or local entities are pitted against each other, and they just don't have the bargaining power to, hold these corporations accountable for the taxes in their area. Are there policy ideas, or how much of the conversation is about this is a large part of that commercial tax, or is that just a very small piece, or are there ideas for trying to enhance that as part of the tax base?
In the big picture, it's a relatively small piece, but if you're Linden, it's a big deal. And whether you get the Home Depot to locate on the north side of 1600 North or the south side, so it's in Linden versus Orem, that's a huge deal for their sales tax revenue. Okay? So yes, you do have local governments competing to attract, under the name of economic development, they compete to attract these businesses. The reality is taxes are a very small component of the decision process of a business location decision. They look at transportation costs, they look at labor costs, they look at access to skilled labor. I mean, Amazon didn't build that big building at the point of the mountain because taxes were low. They built it there because there's a BYU, there's a University of Utah putting out well-trained, competent people, there's a workforce that they can draw on. They also, they bought up another company that was already here, but they expanded and are building here because of the quality of the workforce. Those people can work anywhere, and the fact that we're willing to work for less money, frankly. That our graduates, in order to stay in Utah, will accept lower pay. And if you have to work in Silicon Valley, you demand more because it's expensive to live there. So the competition is there, but taxes are not generally a major factor in a location decision, except at the border between two jurisdictions. If I'm north of the Columbia River or south of the Columbia River, it makes a difference. But am I going to be somewhere in that basin? Absolutely, for reasons other than taxes. Okay. Now, it's very difficult if you're a local government official to sit across the table from a high-powered executive who has all the data and you don't, and negotiate and say, sorry, we're not going to give you that tax break. And you have visions of all of these things going to the next town, and you've lost everything, and so we end up giving away much more of the tax base than we should. There are things that can be done to address that. For example, right now, the sales tax distribution side, once the tax is collected, half of the money is distributed based upon where the sale took place, half of the money is distributed based on where people live. Okay, so one way that we could eliminate this kind of competition for sales tax dollars is to say we're going to distribute it all on the basis of population. There goes the competition. So there are some things that we could do. They're not politically popular, because if you're winning in that competition, you don't want those things to change. So, and I think we better quit, because you're going to stay on schedule, but thank you so much. I've enjoyed this.